Welcome to RCR Wireless News. I'm Martha Degrasse, and our topic today is wireless infrastructure services and the demand for tower climbers. I'm joined today by Peter Jarich. He is VP of Consumer and Infrastructure at Current Analysis. Thanks so much for being here today, Peter.
Thank you.
And Matt Glass is also here, taking the time to join us from his vacation. Matt is Executive Vice President at Nexius, one of our sponsors today. Matt, thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, before we begin, I am going to take just a minute to tell you a little bit about our sponsors today, starting with Nexius. Nexius delivers end-to-end wireless services to leading carriers and business intelligence solutions. Begin by talking a little bit about the intensifying demand for tower climbers. We are lucky enough to be partnered with Telforce Group in the towercruise.net website, and Telforce is telling us that the demand is permeating now to some of the smaller markets. It's what they call the Tier 3 markets. LTE, of course, has already been turned on in most of the major markets, and now the hiring is extending down to areas around metropolitan areas with fewer than 300,000 residents. And so I'd like to ask each of you about what you're hearing from the carriers that you talk to. I know that the carriers themselves are not doing most of this hiring. It's contractors like you, Matt. So would you agree that you're starting to see more hiring centered around some of the smaller markets?
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, many of the cities are launched from an LTE perspective, and we're into most of the carriers use phases to launch their network. So we're into sometimes phase 4 and 5, 6 and 7 for some areas of the country for some of the network carriers and their LTE networks. So we're certainly seeing a shift from more urban to more rural builds, which is actually not a bad thing. It's a little easier to build, a little less time consuming. It's a little more cost efficient on the crews. But certainly we're seeing the network start to fan outside of the heavy urban areas. And I think with that you're seeing it requires more crews. You could install maybe 2 LTE sites a week. If you're in a downtown area, you're looking at maybe 1 a week because you're in areas where sites are farther apart.
Okay, and then is there still an ongoing maintenance requirement for manpower at the existing sites that have already been turned on?
Sure. After network migration, there's a period of probably 6 months. Some OEM contracts may go longer, where you're required to maintain the networks, and there's a lot of alarming issues and other issues as you get through the migration period into optimization.
Thanks. And Peter, what are you hearing from the companies that you talk to as far as plans for build-outs and hiring associated with that?
Sure. I think just mirroring a lot of what Matt said, right? So clearly we know that the major cities are built out, and now there is really this push to make sure that we see that we're not just covering with a blanket of thin coverage, but that we're getting solid coverage out everywhere, right? So even beyond those smaller cities, making sure that as we deploy new spectrum bands for LTE, I think a lot's been made with Verizon doing really well with their initial coverage at 700, but then going into AWS just to make sure that they have some extra coverage out there. So whether it's either in those building out those markets that haven't been built out or building out the urban markets where the capacity demands, we're still seeing that. I mean, clearly there's a lot of deployments going on. Obviously that's going to feed through to what needs to take place actually the deployment side of things, the tower side of things.
So we've talked a little bit about rural markets versus urban markets, but are there any certain parts of the country that you think hiring is stronger than in other parts? Not really, Matt?
Well, I think if you think about the carriers, their businesses are regional, their footprints are regional, their requirements are regional. There's a large metropolitan area in each one of the cities that is booming right now. I will say that as we get into the wintertime, you tend to do less in the far north. Upstate New York is a good example. The Dakotas, it gets very difficult to build in the wintertime. So I know you tend to be more active in the southern half of the United States during the winter months. Most tower climbers would agree they'd like to be more active in the southern parts of the country.
That's a good point. And the skill sets, I think, may be changing or expanding a little bit for tower technicians. Matt, are you finding that tower technicians need to have better software skills now?
Yeah, I think the skill set, the bar is definitely raised for those folks. You've got multiple networks on the tower, along with multiple radios within that network on the tower. You may have multiple dimensions of backhaul on that tower, along with E911 and other nuances. So with that comes not only the knowledge of how each one of these component parts work, so you're maneuvering and getting to the correct apparatus, but also within each one of those parts and pieces are different methods of procedure, what we would call MOPS, and within that are different protocols to run, troubleshooting to run, all with some type of requirement, whether it be a sweep test or a resistivity test or some type of loopback testing. There's some type of test that requires some type of online diagnostics. So the skill set is certainly raised from a software and just a general telecom knowledge component.
So that's tricky because we're hearing from a lot of the companies we talk to that there aren't enough trained climbers, even just based on the skill sets of climbing the towers. So they're trying to bring new people in, and some of the skills that you're describing sound like you would have had to be working in telecom and perhaps even in wireless to pick up those skill sets. Is that right?
Well, agreed. I think therein lies the challenge. And we continue to bring new folks into the industry from the tech schools, from related industries. The wind tower business was a good example. The turbines that run on the wind industry are somewhat complex with their method of procedure as well. We've actually hired recently, Nexius has hired about 25 or 30 folks that came over from the wind turbine side of the business. So I think the complexity yields a greater need for skill set. There is a scarcity of these skill sets. So now you see it's an opportunity for a lot of companies. You see a lot of companies around the U.S. with more intense training programs that include a lot more of the software type skill set and less of the generic climbing stuff.
Okay, great. And Peter, the companies you talk to, are they talking about pain points with hiring? I know you work with some of the OEMs that contract for the carriers to complete these builds, and I'm sure that they do need to hire a lot of people.
Sure, they do. They do. On the other hand, no OEM is ever really going to talk about a pain point, right? Hey, if you have a problem, we're going to solve it. At least from an outward-facing standpoint, they're not going to say, no, we really can't do that. So I think it's not so much the pain point in hiring as it is what do they have to pay to get those folks, what time frames can they offer to their customers, and then ultimately how might they have to reprioritize sort of what they say they can do for someone. Yes, we can do all of that, but you probably want to do this first because, well, we don't have the people to do those other things first. And even, maybe some of what they want to do in terms of the skill sets that are out there, right? Some of these operators are looking for new ways to improve what they're doing, let's say, network capacity, network coverage. Vendors have neat solutions like, let's say, 6-sector sites, sectorization, cool new technologies. If you don't have the tower folks, if you don't have the people who can actually deploy those, test them, deploy it well, yeah, that really limits what you can do.
What about training? Are any of the companies you talk to investing in any training resources, or just leveraging other companies for training?
Yeah, I haven't really heard much on the training in terms of, let's say, the traditional network rollout. I think what you are seeing is some training, let's say, around, where there's some of the newer interests, let's say around small cells, right? Where we're talking about new, non-traditional architectures, we're seeing some stuff there. But of course, that's a completely different ecosystem. That's a completely different sort of model in some ways.
Right, and it does require a slightly or a very different skill set, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a different. Obviously, we're talking about poles. We're talking about strands. We're talking about in-building. We're talking about anywhere where you've got power, where you've got backhaul, as opposed to the traditional tower architecture. So it is really a different mindset, different set of skills.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was at Small Cells Americas earlier this week, and Alcatel-Lucent was demonstrating the light radio, and Mike Schabel told me that it was easy enough that even he could install it. But then he went on to explain that he actually does have some pretty strong technical skills. So maybe not that.
And that's definitely one of the. I mean, I think it's often overlooked that where we are today with small cells does benefit to some extent from working with femtocells. And the overriding challenge there was how do you get these things to be zero install, right? So you're never going to have a zero install base station sort of outside the residential area, but they want to minimize that as much as possible. Again, it goes to sort of this discussion that I think we've been having for a decade plus, this idea that equipment costs are going to come down over time. It may cost X amount of money to build that base station that's small cell today, and over time we expect that to go down just because of technology trends, but labor costs don't, right? So wherever we can find a way to decrease those labor costs to get the install down, to have it touch fewer people, that's the better. But you're never going to get to something, at least a lot of us, where it's just completely hands-off. You're going to need folks out there because things do go wrong, and things, until we have the Amazon drone deployed base station, which I'm really hoping for next year, where the drone just sort of puts the base station down where it needs to be and then leaves, you're going to need folks to actually get them out there and make sure they're working.
Now, Matt, last time we talked, I think you said you were having quite a few exploratory conversations about small cells with customers. Can you sort of update us on that a little bit?
Sure. I think that we've been talking about this small cell craze. It's going to hit. It's any quarter now. I think for the last year and a half, it's been
a year now.
The next quarter. It's been the next quarter. There's no doubt that foot traffic is going to be the next driver for what the handheld or what your devices have to be able to cover. And so you're not going to, especially in heavily populated areas with lots of foot traffic or where folks probably use their devices, you're not going to install outdoor DAS or cell towers. There's going to have to be a small cell application. I think that's absolutely given, is absolutely being still being lab tested and those concepts being improved. The cable companies are rolling out picocell and Wi-Fi as we speak, and have been doing so for the last probably 2 years. So I think you'll see the carriers more and more as we talked last time. The mesh technologies. We work in the labs for several of the carriers. There are mesh technologies in trial. It's that handoff from macro network to small cell and back and forth that is the predominant issue. I think everyone feels like that solution is around the corner, or that those patches of solutions are around the corner. So I believe that I don't know that you'll quite see the craze, but I think you'll see a slow, steady pace towards more venues and then more areas around venues, more downtown areas. I think you'll see that continue the volume of those tech bills continue to increase.
Right. Well, we'll be keeping an eye on it. And it's interesting because that sort of leads to the next topic that we were hoping to discuss, which is field tools that crews are using to work more efficiently. And Peter, we were talking before we started about one of the tools that Amdocs has for technicians deploying small cells, and it's a mobile app, and it just shows the technician where their materials are for the day, where they're going for the day, and even maybe how to work with the equipment that they will be working with that day, so that they can receive instructions on their phone, perhaps in real time. And you had some comments, Peter, about other software solutions, or just the efficacy of software in general to facilitate some of these build outs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting how we really moved from sort of this is a people on the street business, which still needs to be, to the question of, again, how do we put a higher reliance on software where possible so that we can automate as much as possible, right? You look to the Amdocs acquisition of Actix, and it was earlier in the year that Amdocs said they were going to roll out a small cell deployment tool, and that fits into the business, right? It fits into the business from the perspective of being an OSS player in the OSS BSS space. And yes, there's hopes that eventually we can look at things, and you'll hear people talk about this, right? Particularly with small cells. How do we link what's going on in our billing system to what we're doing in the network so we can optimize performance? And that's great, and that's going to happen someday. But in the here and now, it's more like what you're talking about. How do we automate the deployment side of things? Because operators are looking at these situations where they're talking about tens of thousands of small cells being deployed, right? And that's a big challenge, right? We heard about just the limited availability of people to actually go out there. Well, how do you make the best you need those tools to help do that. I think the flip side to that is figuring out where do you put these tools, where do you site them, what are the right places to site them in terms of having power, in terms of having backhaul. Again, you talked a little bit about small cell Americas and the Alcatel-Lucent stuff. Alcatel-Lucent was trying to solve some of that, right, with their certification program, the Metro Cell Express program, where here's a bunch of places where you can go. That helps them get deployed a little bit, but you still need the folks to go out there and do the actual operational side of things. So we're seeing a lot more of that. We're seeing a lot more of using tools to help proactively figure out where maintenance need to take place, right? Hey, let's get out there and do some maintenance before, before it's too late. We've got technicians out in the area. You're at this base station. Oh, the one next to it looks like it's got some problems that we think, might become a bigger issue going forward. As long as you're here, why don't you stop at the next one? So a lot more tools using analytics to figure out where are the right places to go. How do we actually look at those networks to be more efficient with the people that we do have? Again, pointing to Matt's earlier point of, we've only got so many good people out there.
Okay, great, thanks. And Matt, I think analytics is a part of what you offer. Can you tell us a little bit about how that's useful in network build-outs as well as in maintenance?
Well, I think, I think automation was mentioned earlier. I think that's the key. If you think about it, if I go back to the old days, 15 years ago, everything was done via cell phone if you had a signal at the site. Now everything is so compartmentalized, so fast. There's a lot of data that's got to come from the field and get back to the switch or to the RF engineering team, especially if there's issues. So I think most of the tools that we work with now, Nexius as well as probably other turfing companies and tier 1 vendors, clients as well, carriers as well, use a suite of tools. And I think we're all trying to avoid multi-touch points. So we want data entry to happen once, if at all. So we talked about earlier, we talked about pictures and sweep data, maybe diagnostic reports in the field. Those should be able to go automated from the site to wherever they need to go to, whether it be a switch or an RF engineering group, so they can look at the issue, give direction back out to the field without having to demobilize and remobilize. That was the trick in the old days, or the problem in the old days, was that you were always calculating your cost and your risk by the amount of times you had to mobilize to a site, rig the tower, so on and so forth. I think now what we're trying to do is get to what we call one truck roll, one mobilization, and all these tools allow you to, it's very critical because it takes the crew an hour and a half to rig the tower. So it's critical that all these, and the beginning now we actually have handheld devices. It used to be laptops and air cards. Now it's handheld devices. You can take all this data from the cell site, get it right into these folks that are in these centralized operation centers, the experts, who can then give direction on how to correct issues, solve problems, or approve the site and move the crew on to the next site.
Yeah, and that's one of our sponsors, Field Dailies, is involved in that, particularly with the field reporting. I think that has to happen. Right. How about, when you're finished with a site deployment, roughly how many pictures do you think you normally have to submit before you are really able to say you're finished?
Too many. No. It varies by carrier and by what application you're doing. The new site build will obviously be probably more photos than a site overlay. But it's a lot, and there's a lot of data. There's the photos, there's different documents. There's ground resistivity testing, which is the grounding test of the site. There's cable testing, which involves making sure that the coax or fiber cable is installed appropriately. So there's all this data along with the amount of pictures that is compiled by companies like Field Dailies. They provide software to compile that, compress it, which allows you to then shift that information in some type of shared database, so they can be looked at by quality managers somewhere offsite who can release that crew or review that. But I would say, when I first started just building towers 17, 18 years ago, there was probably a handful of pictures, some ground testing. If you really build and sent somewhere to be approved before you can leave that site.
Okay, and for a company like a Field Dailies or a company that has a specific solution to solve, maybe one part of the process, of the problems within the process, what is the best approach for a company like that wants to get in front of, say, a company like yours and show their solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think the carriers have been very good about communicating out the structure of the tier one vendors or whoever their vendors are that are performing in a certain area. And I know myself and I know a lot of my colleagues. We're always looking for ways to make it more efficient. I mean, we all have mid-sized to some of us large-sized companies, and we've got our platforms and internal governance along with carrier or client big systems, big tools and governance, and the amount of tools that we can find to make it less data entry between the two, um, more efficient, certainly it's usually worth its weight in gold. So absolutely, I would encourage anybody with an idea or concept or tool. We're around. We're at all the we're always at the different wireless conventions and all the different things, and we're certainly in the AT&T markets. We have local offices in all the markets that we're in, so we'd certainly love to hear about it.
Okay, thanks. Now, Peter, I think maybe you can speak a little bit to some of the specific software areas where new solutions are likely to pop up. I think that from OSS to maybe more specific parts within the network, there are places where companies are going to be offering
Solutions out there. Yes, operators have their own tools, but helping them figure out where they need to be focused, whether that's on deployment, whether that's on maintenance, whether that's on upkeep, again, the proactive side of things. And I think that's just going to be key. I think the other part is talking about how do they minimize drive tests, particularly to figure out what is the status of the network. Again, trying to help them figure out where they need. Again, I think Matt talked about the idea of small cells really being out there to help figure out where are those capacity holes, where are those, where is the foot traffic going? Well, you've got to have people generally figuring it out. It's just typically the way it's been done is right with drive tests, right? You got drive tests to figure out where's the network performing, where's it not performing, how is it meeting those demands. Well, you can minimize that. I think that's great. I think one of the issues, though, and it's interesting, I think, if we go about how, to your question of how do smaller vendors sort of get into a larger vendor, I think part of the solution was hinted at in terms of the way Matt talked about how the operators have their governance and how they work with their larger vendors. I think what we've seen happen quite a few times, though, is those smaller vendors going directly to the operators, selling their better mousetrap to the operator, and then forcing the operator's preferred vendor to work with that smaller vendor. Not necessarily what the larger vendor wants to hear. I think that, it's always nice to control that relationship, but I think there's no shortage of examples out there of smaller vendors going straight and saying, hey, I've got a cool solution. And I think it's become a little bit easier, particularly as we look at LTE. You've got every single operator out there, not every single operator, but the ones in the U.S. at least, the ones that we're talking to, have innovation centers, right? Those innovation centers are sort of meant to be, come on in, show me your solution, show me your better mousetrap, and if it makes sense, maybe we'll give you some time. I think it opens up an opportunity for those guys, an avenue for them to take their solutions and say, hey, here's what I can do for you. And then if they are too small to be engaged with directly, then they end up getting that introduction to the larger vendors.
Right. Okay. So sort of doing an end run around the companies that they may end up working with in the long run.
Exactly. I wouldn't want to use the term end run because it's probably too appropriate. But yeah, that's essentially it.
Okay. Well, we are almost out of time. Matt, do you have any closing comments?
No, I enjoyed the chat, and I look forward to doing more.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us. Matt Glass, Executive Vice President at Nexius. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks.
Peter, do you have any closing comments today?
No, I think that's it. I think it's a fun space to be, and hopefully we'll continue watching it. Hopefully we can have more chats.
Okay, we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. This has been Wireless Infrastructure Services, RCR Wireless News. Thank you for joining us today.